Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, brought to you by Bethany Lutheran Church in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado. Today's episode, I have good news. He's back. Bryan Jaster is joining me again for another lively, energetic conversation. This conversation builds upon the one that Bryan and I had several episodes back. You might remember I brought Bryan on and we talked about discipleship. Well, today we're talking about service learning, which, as we describe in our conversation, is really kind of another way of thinking about discipleship, a focused version of it. It's something that Bryan is so passionate about and so well-spoken. He's been doing this type of work for a long time and thought a lot about it. So we wanted to bring it to you today. Also, just so you know, stay tuned towards the end of our conversation. Bryan and I mention a service learning opportunity that's coming up really soon here at Bethany, so you don't want to miss that. But now, without further ado, here's Bryan and I talking service learning. All right, I'm here with Bryan Jaster, and the last time Bryan was on this podcast, we talked about discipleship, and Bryan got really excited, as he often does when he gets talking about things that he loves and is passionate about. And so we wanted to do a follow-up as well, because Bryan's just fun to talk to, and so we're going to kind of take a tangential point to discipleship, I think we could say, and we want to talk about service learning. And I'll be honest, the way that this came up is I said, Bryan, you did such a good job on the podcast last time. What else are you good at talking about? What else do you want to talk about? And he's like, service learning. So that's why we're here. But you'll also see that this sets up perfectly for some fun things we're going to be doing at Bethany in the coming weeks. But Bryan, I mean, the service learning, that sounds probably like, word jumble, word salad to some people.
Yeah.
What the heck does that even mean?
Yeah. Gosh, yeah, service learning, I don't know who came up with the words, and they work, but if that does sound like, like some kind of complicated speak, it's not. It simply means that Jesus serves first, puts himself last, puts others first, loves others with his whole life, and we get to as well. And in that act of doing things the way that Jesus does, we certainly get to learn from it. We get to learn about who people are. We get to learn about this world that God loves. We get to learn about ourselves. And so the whole journey of service learning is just becoming last of all and servant of all and being Jesus' disciple, wherever we are. And it can happen if you're opening a door or listening to someone, building something, wherever you are at any time. So it's both accidental and it's both intentional.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like, it's kind of, it really does make sense that we're doing this as the next podcast after discipleship, whereas discipleship, You're kind of talking with broad strokes, but Correct. Service learning is something pretty specific, and yet it's a very specific form of following Jesus, is what I hear you saying.
Absolutely. You bet. So that's the thing. It is how we live as disciples is to serve first. Jesus said it to his, I think, disciples at that point who were wondering where they get their places of power and authority. And in contrast, he says, well, whoever wants to follow has to be last of all and servant of all. And so we get that invitation from Jesus to live a little different life than we might have expected. But it is an intentional call. And so, I'd like to tell a story or two about that. I can tell you about kind of like the process for everybody, wherever you are, and kind of how it goes every day. Well, and let me ask a question. I do want to hear these stories, but is it fair to say that, like, the disciples themselves were engaged in service learning? Because they were kind of watching Jesus do things, and then Jesus would routinely send them out to also go and serve. And so is that basically what we're talking about when we say service learning? Yes. There's even this story, I think it's like in Luke chapter 10 or 11, where he sends them out in pairs, right? And this is a very intentional step. Like, he's trained them so far. Maybe it's behind the scenes, maybe it's around campfires, but he's finally said, okay, now it's really your turn. You're going to go and do this, and they get to come back and they get to process it and learn from it again. So he very much had this intentional, like this vision in mind for how he's going to train these, plan B disciples as they were, and how they might go out and change this world. And I guess that's the thing about service learning is it's transformative.
Yeah.
What I want to say first is the goal of the whole process is it's transformative. So if I might just throw this out, service learning happens through preparation, through action, through reflection, and through celebration. And so wherever we are, whatever we're doing, and however we want to serve, if we want to engage in intentionally, it's going to happen through that kind of flow. And so if we prepare well, if we act well, if we reflect on it well, if we celebrate well, we'll receive the most fruitfulness of the transformation, or whatever that means. Whatever it is that God wants to make us look a little bit more like the life of Jesus in the world, that whole process. It does happen if we really, truly attempt to engage as much of that as we can.
So what's really interesting, though, about the way you're describing this is that it sounds like the goal of service learning isn't necessarily what you accomplish
Not at all.
while serving.
Nope.
So you're not like measuring like, oh, we built 12 houses,
Nope.
we cleaned up 18 parks. I mean, that's good.
That's good. That's part of it.
But you're kind of flipping the script and saying, no, by engaging in service learning, it's changing you on a personal level. It's a transformational process.
Yeah, and I think, like, for example, like schools have, like, service hours, which is good, right? But the place that I think schools wish that they could do more fully is they could go full circle with people and say, well, this is actually about life transformation, world transformation. What does happen with schools, for example, though, as I've experienced, is like, often it's like, well, how many hours did kids put in, and what did they accomplish? Which are good things, but it's not quite the whole picture. What Jesus engages is that whole life picture in a way that I wish we always could in every sphere, where it's church or congregation or home. And so, like, for example, the preparation stage is so important. So let's say, for example, we want to have something that looks like a multicultural experience. Well, one of the things I might have to do the hard work of figuring out what is the baggage I might bring to a situation. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to a place where people speak a different language, or if they're a different income level, how do I prepare myself to be less? How do I prepare myself to be servant last of all? How do I get rid of the assumptions that I might bring with? All the things that might get in the way of an actual experience of Jesus at work in the world. So there's no longer like us versus them or a hierarchy. It's simply us.
Yeah.
So that's a hard work. Because, like, for example, I went on a mission week in Guatemala, right? In a very impoverished part of rural kind of near Antigua, Guatemala. And that was one of the huge things we had to do was how do we prepare ourselves in a way that actually diminishes ourselves, that gets rid of some things, that names our baggage. Because we can often bring to ourselves whatever it is. You know, we can quickly turn into, like, I don't know, maybe it's wealthy people trying to fix something, right? We throw money at it. Well, some of the preparation that's healthy is listen to Jesus. Say, you must be last of all and servant of all. Well, what does that look like? So sometimes the preparation is actually the harder work than the actual thing you're doing.
Yeah.
And
I'm thinking of part of your involvement in service learning relates to the National ELCA Youth Gathering, correct? Mm-hmm. Right? And so when I was growing up, and then I also had the chance to work on a couple of those youth gatherings myself, it was just this big event.
Yep.
Where 30,000 Lutheran youth from all over the country gather together. And it's always like there's always big worship services and like Christian bands and these interaction centers where there's a whole bunch of fun things to do all day. And that was how it was when I was growing up. But a few years back, probably about a decade ago or so, they changed it, didn't they?
Yeah, it did. And it changed partly in response to, I think we had some sense that the gathering was going to be in New Orleans. And then Hurricane Katrina happened. So I think just the trauma and the tragedy of a natural disaster that genuinely transformed that part of the world really changed for the gathering, because we asked, like, what does New Orleans most need? What does New Orleans need from God and from God's people?
Yeah.
And what can we do together as we of New Orleans for the love of the community, the love of the space, and the transformation of the world? And that's actually why the youth gathering ended up coming back in 2012, because they felt those same questions had so much urgency still, because there still was so much pain, so much devastation about land and property and houses that it was worth it. And so that's kind of the, as the gathering prepared, to act together, that was the thing, like, okay, how do we know that what we're going to do is going to make us feel like we're last now a little bit, like we're truly humbling ourselves, and yet finding in all the spaces the story and the life of the people who just need someone to walk alongside them.
Well, and when I was going to the youth gathering as a youth myself was a transformational experience.
Yep, absolutely.
And yet I did no service project, right? Like this was, I forget what year that it was that I went to it, but just wasn't a part of what we were doing there.
Right.
And it really seems wise, in my opinion, for them to kind of make this transition. There's still some really amazing things that happen, and just the reality of getting 30,000 people together who all share the same faith is in of itself transformational. Mm-hmm. But to then also add this service learning element to it and make that the focus and the goal, not only, right, like when you bring in 30,000 people to work in a city, that changes the city for the better, one would hope.
It does, yep.
A lot can get done with that mass of people. but also for each of the individuals who are coming to
Yes.
be a part of that service learning experience. And I'm sure you've seen it. So I'm sure maybe it's the youth gathering or other trips you've led. Talk to us about like ways you've seen that kind of happen.
So many. I mean, I think the thing about service learning, and it's important, is the transformation that happens. We simply cannot anticipate in advance, simply because we are not in charge. This is the Spirit's work. And so when it's the Spirit's work, unexpected things are going to happen. And so one example I give of this is when we were in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is mid-July of 2012. They'd had a tornado come through just before and had cut a mile-wide path through town. Absolute devastation. It missed the university, but it just cut a mile-wide path. And so we were in a neighborhood where there had been 500 homes, and there was like 4 homes standing. And we were in others where it was just truly debris land, trees everywhere, leaning against houses and poking through, right? And so we joined with an organization there that plopped us in the middle of this neighborhood and put us in a couple different sites and just said, start cleaning stuff out, start moving debris, start doing things. And that was the action that we knew we were going to be doing. And we did that. Sweated immensely. Chick-fil-A brought us food for free. Like, all this stuff happened. It was just absolutely unbelievable. Well, here's what got our attention, though. And this is where service learning takes that twist from focusing on the thing you know you're doing, which is we knew how many cars we had, we knew how many shovels, all that stuff, to the things that God might surprise you most. And we had taken a small break, probably just after lunch, sweating crazy, had about 100 people. Somehow we managed to get all the people to kind of stop at the same moment and had a moment where we were going to get to kind of talk about something specific. And one of my students, who was, I think, then a sophomore, she said to everybody, stop. Look at this bee. And we were like, wait, what are you talking about? We're talking about all kinds of all these conversations. And she stands up and she says, no, really, everybody stop. Look what this bee is doing. Well, sure up in the ground, I mean, we're in the kind of like debris central, like tree limbs and logs and dirt and ash and all kinds of stuff and all the things that are going on. She's looking at this bee who has been digging a hole in the ground over and over and over again. And she's like, I bet that bee's been doing this for a long time. And we're like, yeah? She's like, I bet that bee is like God. And we're like, what do you mean? She's like, well, because that bee was working on this a long time before we were here, and that bee will be here a lot longer after we're gone, still doing its thing.
Huh.
Everybody's minds were blown. I mean, absolutely, we're like, what? And it was so interesting because what was service learning? Service learning was listening to this student, listening to this tiny little bee doing its thing. It was not the thing that we thought we were there for, which, again, we did some of that stuff. I got a picture somewhere of like 15 huge high school guys carrying this massive tree down the road because they were so excited they could actually pick it up. And it weighed like, oh my gosh, like 2,000 pounds,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
And just getting off the ground, the sweat and the grunting, like it was great. And they remember that, but guess what? We remember those moments too. The little teeny bee that's been doing the work of God, evidently, before we were there and will be there long after. And so that's also part of the thing about service learning. It becomes a moment where you realize it's just not about you. We live in this world with so much consumerism that just seeps in our bones everywhere. You know, you can choose your countertops, you can pick your cereal, Colgate or Crest. Like, we're always consuming something, and it's for us and for our preferences. Service learning turns that whole thing on its head and says it's just not about you. Yeah. It's really about God already doing as God's doing. You get to join in and play and do the dance, sing the song, buzz with the bee, whatever it is. And so that's the transformative thing, is those moments where you just realize you're part of something significant going on. So that's the learning event, right? And the learning event, you get to ask, what happened, what, so what, and now what? What happened, so what, and now what? Because service learning transforms you. When you ask that question, now what? Now that I've seen this bee doing the tiniest thing that's going to be gone a lot longer than I have, and will keep on going, that looks a lot like what God is doing. Well, now what? Now what do I do with that? How does that shape my life along the ways of Jesus to be last and uncertain of all? And so that's the thing. If you're listening to this right now, whatever you're doing, like, let's say someone else opened the door for you today. You're at, maybe you went somewhere, maybe you went to Target. Somebody opened the door for you, or they let you go in front of them in line, right? Just watch that moment and say, well, what happened? Well, what really just happened there? And then say, so what? Well, why did that happen? And then now what? Well, will I do that with my life? Will I put someone else first? Because service learning does not take an entire trip. And that's the one big thing that I think the church in America has screwed up big time. We have this whole idea of big mission trips and of this, time where we did the Western expansion and we killed off millions of people and we took over and we dominated, that was completely wrong. Service learning is every day, everywhere, and it's little teeny acts of being lastable and serving all along the way of Jesus.
Yeah, so it's more of like a mindset thing.
It is.
Than anything else. And what's really, right, like, and so when you're, that makes so much sense too in light of everything else that you've already told us as a part of this conversation, right, is that it's about changing your mindset. Like, and when Jesus comes and changes our life, that transformational moment, more often than not, it's our mindset that's changing. We're just led to see the world in a different way. Like, I think about the individual you're mentioning on this Tuscaloosa trip.
Yeah.
What was her name again? Did you say her name?
I didn't, but yeah.
Oh, wait. But so she, right, like, was changed by that experience. Yep. Probably would not, in a normal day, have stopped to look and consider the bee.
Yeah.
But just experiencing that and being a part of that entire moment causes her to be like, wait a second, I'm noticing this now, right? It's a total mindset change.
Oh, yeah.
And that could happen then, like, who knows if that happened for her as well, back at home, 2 weeks later or long after the trip was over.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do we keep on praying the way we keep on praying? Why do we keep on reading Scripture the way we keep on reading Scripture? Because that prepares us over and over and again. It's like the iron that's us just keep getting refined and sharpened and honed and shaped over and over again, day after day, day after day after day. That student, absolutely. It's the stuff we've done to prepare in the 6, 8, 10, 12 months before that, and absolutely somehow gotten her ready to receive that moment too, to listen to and drink in the experience too. So it's not like it was a complete accident. I mean, there is something to be said that God is always working on us. And God always wants to shape us in a certain way that does look like Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, every day being aware of this whole rhythm of service learning is significant, because it doesn't all happen at once. It's like slow incremental steps along the way that happens. And so, again, I invite you to ask, like, what, so what, and now what is a process to kind of engage that wherever you're at.
Yeah, and I love that. Yeah, what's happening, so what, now what, right? Like, it's a very intentional, a very mindful practice. And you've heard me ramble about this a lot before, but I just think that when it comes to a life of faith, like, the most important thing we can do is really simple. It's just remember God, right? Like, just bring that lens into whatever, and that's exactly what you're describing, right? Like, just pause for a second. What's happening? Where is God in this situation? Okay, so what? Okay, now what? Yeah, I love that.
And I think this is so huge right now. If you're listening to this anytime in 2020, there is a dramatic amount of uncertainty, of fear, and of chaos that's trying to tell us a story. And on some level, I want to shout back at that and say, this is a lie.
Yeah.
Because we are actually part of God's story, by a God whose love is boundless, timeless, and yet for this time. And so the gift that we have is that God wants to speak to us something new. And that's why we think for Advent, this journey we call prophet projects, where we get to hear the voices of the prophets who tell us a specific story that we so desperately need to hear. And friends, listen, this is not like, another thing that we're kind of doing. We hope and believe that this is essential and so deeply needed for life, that we do these service learning projects for needs that we actually know in the world. And the truth is, what we learn from it is going to be unexpected.
Yeah, that's really good. That God's just going to surprise us with whatever's going on.
Something's going to happen in this.
It's not as linear and logical as we might expect. Right, yeah. It's like your friend, again, didn't expect to be moved by the workings of a bee. It's totally unexpected. But Bryan did a really good job. He was getting to the now what of all this. I didn't realize it.
Yep.
But yes, at Bethany, during the Advent season, we are going to be focusing on voices of the prophets. And so during worship, every week, we'll be focusing on a different prophecy, a different prophet from long ago who said some things that seem to predict the coming of Jesus and Jesus' implications for our life. Another thing that prophets often did, though, and these also show up in Advent, prophets were often saying, hey, you need to care about those people who are most in need. You need to be caring about the vulnerable. That seemed to be a continual cry of the prophets, depending on, if you're reading Jeremiah or Isaiah or Micah, they're oftentimes saying, care for those who are in need. And so we're kind of putting these two together, and we have a service learning project for the entire Bethany community to take part in during the Advent season. And one of the things that's most frustrating about this COVID time is that you can't go and volunteer like you used to. A lot of the places won't let you in. We used to do those meal packings here at Bethany, which were fun and joyous and great for all ages. Can't be doing that right now. So we put our heads together, and we've come up with the Prophet Projects, and we think we've got a way for people at home to engage in all of this. Do you want to say more about it, Bryan?
Oh, that's perfect. And it's just simply to ultimately do what is most needed and to put ourselves a little last. Because it's not like these are going to be easy either. It's something that's going to take your time, energy, commitment. And we're also going to celebrate in some really weird ways that I hope, one, high school youth can come up with some of those weird ways, and they're writing a devotional called Voices of the Prophet with some people that just helps tell the story that needs to be told by us, that needs to be told as God's story for this time. Lest we think that the story of everything sucks, life's falling apart, is the only story we have.
Right. No, we don't. Yeah, we live by a different story, even in difficult times like this.
Yep.
And so for the Prophet Projects, yeah, there'll be a devotional book that kind of links in with this whole theme of Voices of the Prophets. But our hope for Prophet Projects is we are going to be collecting warm clothing, etc., for Denver Rescue Mission, which serves the homeless population in Denver. Winters get cold in Denver, and homelessness is definitely up during these times as people struggle with paying rent and everything else. And so we want to, be supporting that really important ministry. And again, we also wanted to try and find a way so that you, as an individual or as a family, could do some work at home, work with your hands. So we found a way to make really simple blankets. Some of you are already super talented and you're like, oh, I can sew hats and mittens and gloves and all that. Great. But then we also wanted those like Bryan and I, who maybe aren't as crafty.
Yep.
And we found some really great, we'll be putting together kind of like these kits that'll show you how to make the first, your first fleece blanket that could then be donated to Denver Rescue Mission to help the homeless. And our hope is that families and individuals will kind of take up this challenge, that we'll get a good count going of all the, right? Not that it's about the numbers that we contribute, but that's just a fun way to track the work that's going on, the service learning that's happening in our midst. So stay tuned for more details on that. We did want to kind of tease that as the now what. But Bryan, any closing thoughts for us? Just to tie a neat bow on service learning in general.
Well, wherever you are today, know that Jesus has gone before us and is telling a story where he invites you into the story. And it's a story where to be his follower, to walk in his footsteps, to be covered with the dust of our Rabbi Jesus, as Kira would say, you get to be last of all and servant of all. And in that place, you are enough. You are named, you are called, you are sent. So rise up, dear people of Bethany and world. Be those disciples and love this world well as we approach Advent.
Awesome. Bryan, thanks for being here as always. And as we say at the end of every podcast, friends, stay in peace.